There's a possibility, a very strong argument could be made for a Dow of 1,650, which would put the Dow at about, 12%, 13% of where it is today, and be there in a matter of a year or two. Now we come to the answer to the question posed. The answer to the question is, can you see 80% of a nation's paper wealth disappear without having substantial systemic instability? All it would take, for example, would be a major disruption to the nation's power system. The grid intertie, the system that runs the trains that bring the coal to fire the plants that power the grid that drill the wells that pump the oil from Texas and other states to the Northeast. Any disruption at critical infrastructure can cascade and then effectively shut down the rest of the system. So one of the characteristics of complex systems, and I guess it's almost analogous to a jet engine in an airplane, they're extraordinarily reliable when they're working. But when the critical part of the engine begins to fail, you blow off a few turbine blades in a compressor section, suddenly you've got holes in the hot section, and that engine is coming apart. Complex systems are analogous to that. They're really, really robust until they stop being robust. So where is it that society crosses that threshold to unsustainable? I wish I could tell you, but my personal view, and the reason that I've got 3,500 watts of solar panel and live in a fairly sunny part of the country, is that I believe it is possible to structure one's life so that if everything works out fine, you come out an economic winner. If things do not come out fine, you're at least in a position to survive and maybe help a few others do so in the process. Long answer, I apologize, but it's a sweeping question, and the response is a multivariate. It's got a financial dimension, it's got an energy dimension, and so forth. Are y'all there?
Oh yes, I'm here.
Sorry.
I was curious if you were going to throw another dimension on there. But it was a very thorough and complete answer. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Ellery, thank you, and thank you, George. Our next question will come from Skyhenge.
Hi, George. All right, my question has 3 parts. Each part is the end of this first part. What will you do, or where on earth do you plan on flying your plane to in the following situations? Situation A, dictatorship in the U.S. becomes a reality. Will you live under a dictatorship, or will you go elsewhere? What's your destination location in this situation?
I assume that's part 1, right?
That's part 1, yes.
Okay, part 1. I just wrote up a piece that's in this morning's Peoplenomics column. And it's almost a discussion of socioeconomic quanta, because political developments are almost analogous to the Doppler problem of an approaching train. It depends where you stand as to whether you're seeing a dictatorship or not. In other words, a dictator with the support of the richest 70% of the population has a pretty good chance of staying in power. On the other hand, if a dictator's popularity drops below, say, 15, 20%, then that dictator has very little, if any, likelihood of staying in power long term. Where are we in the United States? I am deeply troubled by the action this week to allow the military to detain what are perceived to be enemy combatants of the United States on U.S. soil. It seems to me that that's an extraordinarily dangerous move to occur. Unfortunately, however, there isn't much, if anything, that American citizens can really do to stop things, because, and this gets into a quite an interesting discussion, because we really have two systems of law in the United States. We have the civil system of law, and then we have the administrative systems of law, which I would lump the military in as an administrative system, which does not generally have a route of review to the civilian court, and also under administrative law, there is so much administrative law nowadays that it's nearly impossible to unravel the ball of yarn. Just as one example, you'll remember a while back the National Animal Identification System was proposed by the Department of Agriculture, and it was roundly booed out of existence, but as it turns out, only temporarily. The Department of Agriculture is now essentially rebuilding that whole system, but they're doing it in a piecework way. In other words, there's a proposal now for the Department of Agriculture under the aegis of animal health surveillance for veterinarians to build a national database which would allow for collection of various personal information about the folks that own and raise animals. And it includes things like records being preserved for 150 years. Beyond that, in a whole separate proceeding, the Agriculture Department is building a set of regulations relative to the interstate transportation of animals. And so just as we have seen the evolution of corporations as pseudo-human learning machines that will go out and exploit economic opportunity, we're seeing within the administrative law structure globally a tendency to ignore the expressed will of the people and proceed by taking what administrators believe to be the right course and dividing it up into little sub-pieces, putting those sub-pieces in place for later reassembly into administrative and regulatory controls. In other words, Animal National Identification System was one big gob of stuff, easily opposed. But when broken up into 3 or 4 parts, who can argue about keeping an eye on interstate transportation of animals? It becomes a lot less easy to target that. Or who can oppose just building a database for veterinarians and for people doing animal studies? Well, again, it's hard to oppose those individual pieces. But if you picture that as being slices of salami that can then be assembled into a method of control of the nation's food stocks, then it becomes quite troublesome. Now, whether that ever occurs in that fashion becomes a matter of some conjecture. And so, yes, a dictatorship is possible. And to your direct question, where would we fly our airplane under a dictatorship? The answer clearly is nowhere. On the other hand, when we were on our way back from California to Texas in our airplane this week, we met some very nice people from the Drug Enforcement Administration at one of our stopover airports. And they were just doing a routine check of the kinds of people, pilots, and equipment that was coming through that part of the South where one would expect a lot of drug traffic and human traffic might want to avail themselves of aircraft for transportation. And they only asked me two very simple questions. Can we see your pilot's license? And of course, the answer to anyone with a badge on a string around their neck is, oh, sure, you bet. And the other thing was, can we see your current medical? Oh, sure, you bet, is also the correct answer there. So in all the time I was a newscaster and more recently here traveling around the country, I'd become aware that we have increasing controls on internal travel, especially along the I-10, I-8 corridor heading out west. But I'd never, I've always just been waved through the checkpoints on the freeway. And it was interesting to actually have federal representation as well as a couple of armed local sheriffs at this particular location, looking in on the people that were flying airplanes around. But do I have a problem with that? No, because it really, I think, and this is just an opinion, I see that as a legitimate law enforcement and DEA kind of an operation. So the question really becomes one of, if we slide into dictatorship, what's the destination in the airplane? We don't have one. We can, at least in theory, get all the way across the Caribbean to Cancun, but I'm not sure going to Mexico would be any better than staying on 30 acres of well-equipped property in East Texas. So, and would I live under a dictatorship? The answer is only until I can break it or flee it. And if I think the airplane could get me to someplace where I would not have to live under a dictatorship, then I would use whatever tools are available. But in terms of worrying about that, I have great respect for entropy as one of the great tools of patient people. And I don't believe that there are enough people in America who would put up with a dictatorship for more than just a very few minutes. So I'm optimistic that if you think Occupy movements are big, wait till somebody starts really stepping on Americans' traditional rights to freely associate, freely congregate, and freely travel. Long answer. And I don't mean to sound wishy-washy about it, but as the late Senator Scoop Jackson told me once in a news conference in about 1970, George, I don't answer hypothetical questions, much as Cliff doesn't answer why questions. It's never good to explain one's intended moves before making them.